As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
Goodfellas just turned 30. It's one of my favorite movies. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Story is Everything. Goodfellas is still one of the best gangster movies of all time, and it still really, really works. Since this channel is coming from a writer's perspective, I think there's a lot that any writer can get out of rewatching Goodfellas, and if you've never seen it, go see it. But be warned, spoilers follow. Goodfellas is a tragedy, so it doesn't have a real traditional 3-act structure. Tragedies have 5-act structures. And there are some similarities between 3 and 5-act structures, so you'll see a lot of the same points in either, but it's really important to note the differences. If you tried to wedge Goodfellas into a 3-act structure, it might be something like this. We see a normal world where Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta, is watching mobsters do their mobster thing in his Brooklyn neighborhood. The inciting incident would be where Henry meets Jimmy Conway, played by Robert De Niro, and he's an established gangster who's going to change Henry Hill's life. Plot point 1 at the end of the first act is probably the Air France heist, which kind of puts Henry on the map. Next is the rising action of more gang life, and things are going pretty well in this section. The midpoint is when Henry goes to prison, I guess. Plot point 2 at the end of the second act is probably when Tommy gets whacked for killing Billy Batts. The climax is the drug nightmare section where Henry's running around town followed by the helicopter, and then he gets arrested. And in the denouement, Henry goes into the witness protection program. Honestly, it's really hard to pick those points out, and that's because that's not how a tragic structure works. In a 3-act structure, you'll see an inciting incident where a character is called into action. They may have to be pushed, but by the end of the first act, they're in the story and they have a goal in mind. They have a concrete and achievable goal. Blow up the Death Star, win the karate tournament, get the medal saying you're Top Gun, whatever it is. Goodfellas doesn't really have that kind of goal. In a tragedy, the first act is totally different, and it's called the anticipation stage. In the anticipation stage, our tragic hero knows that something's missing from their life. Whatever it is, the hero needs it. It's going to make them complete. Whether it's fame or love or power, it doesn't really matter. In Goodfellas, what's missing is Henry's need to be a gangster. That's it. That's the goal, and he says so himself. The protagonist doesn't have a clearly defined goal like in a 3-act structure, whether it's a movie or a novel. Henry's goal isn't something you can physically hold in your hand. So the anticipation stage shows Henry's need, and it shows him starting to work toward achieving that goal. Goodfellas is one of the most famous movies to heavily rely on a voiceover, and it's one of the best at it. Writing experts always say that you shouldn't use a voiceover. It's one of those sort of written, unwritten rules in storytelling, and there's a reason for it. Voiceover is oftentimes exposition, and bad exposition can be boring as hell. It's like Hollywood director Billy Wilder said, the thing about voiceovers, you have to be very careful there that you don't show what they're already seeing. Add to what they're seeing. And in Goodfellas, the voiceover absolutely adds. The script was written with a voiceover throughout basically the entire movie, every scene. And then they removed it anywhere they felt that it wasn't adding to the story. And it works because it's not just explaining everything to you. It reveals character and tone. It helps highlight emotions. And there's only enough to frame the story, to add color and nothing extra. It doesn't reveal massive amounts of the plot with no purpose. If you're struggling with exposition in your story, I think there's a lesson to be learned. Use what you need, but keep a lot of it in your audience's head. Let them connect the dots. Let them put 2 and 2 together. Because people are smart, and they'll get it if you present your explanations in a way that's clear and to the point, but that leaves them as an active participant. The second stage of a tragedy is called the dream stage, and in Goodfellas, it's still really early in the story. In the dream stage, there's a point of no return, and in Goodfellas, that's when Henry and Tommy DeVito, played by Joe Pesci, steal $400,000 from Air France. Henry's a full-blown gangster now, and there's no going back. Henry begins to have some early success. He's making scores, he's doing deals, and he's making a name for himself. In a 3-act structure, I guess this would be kind of like the first half of the second act, where the character is making their first efforts to achieve their goal, and things are going pretty well. But in the tragedy, Henry's already achieved his goal of becoming a gangster. Now he just needs to hang on to it, which is easier said than done. This scene, the Copacabana scene, shows us traveling through the labyrinth of the underworld of the Copacabana. Henry's hit the peak of his life, and he's never going to have more. One interesting note in this scene, they actually originally planned to have Henry and Karen going through the front door, but the Copacabana Club didn't want them showing the front door. So Martin Scorsese improvised and created this intricate, weaving, mesmerizing shot that works to show how glamorous the lifestyle is, how alluring it is for both Henry and Karen. It seduces both characters. I think there's a great lesson there for a writer that you can create some really cool stuff if you have some limitations to overcome. If you've got a problematic scene that you're struggling with, maybe approach it from a totally different angle. Speaking of characters, one of the coolest things about Goodfellas are the characters. They're not perfect or perfectly evil, although Tommy comes pretty close. The writing isn't afraid to show some real pieces of shit on screen. These characters, they're made to be likable, or at least you can identify with them, and that's an important part of telling a good story. A lot of stuff I read, writers are afraid to give their characters, especially a protagonist, any sort of negative traits, and that can cause a blank slate character that's really boring to watch, and those kinds of characters that bore us are generally not going to be very well liked. So don't be afraid to write a character with some real flaws. Goodfellas is based on a book called Wise Guy by Nick Pileggi. Director Martin Scorsese asked Pileggi to adapt the book into a script, and both Scorsese and Pileggi worked on it completely separately. Each of them removed a bunch of stuff, but what they ended up with was a very similar finished product. The story had been distilled down to exactly what was essential. I think any writer can improve their work by making sure there's nothing in there that doesn't belong. If it doesn't drive the story or the plot or the character, then why is it there? The next stage of the tragedy is where things start to go bad. It's called the frustration stage, and we see some really bad stuff happening, and the audience starts to see that things are probably going to end up going pretty awful by the end. In Goodfellas, every scene, the conflict is ratcheting up. The movie never stays flat. It's always increasing, and successful stories do that. The Billy Bat scene here is pivotal. That conflict is pumped up even more, and we finally have caught up to the framing device scene that was shown at the beginning of the movie. Right after the framing scene, we relive a brief moment. There's a table brought out at the Copacabana, but it's kind of a hollow version of the original one. The shines come off, the thrill is gone. We're in a darker version of the first half of the movie, and we don't know where it's going now. Everything is led up to this, and while the writer and director have let us know that we're in good hands, anything can happen. All we know is it's probably going to go bad. The second frustration stage turning point is the murder of Spider. That's the actual midpoint of the movie. It completely changes the audience's opinion. It completes the two-part switch from the normal world into the underworld. The mob world goes from the viewpoint of a kind of optimistic kid to more of a pessimistic adult in that scene, and Henry starts to see the world like it really is. And how can you show that turn with your character in whatever you're writing? What scene perfectly illustrates that turn, the descent into the underworld, into hell? That's a point that's in both traditional 3-act structures and 5-act structures. The nightmare stage begins when Henry gets out of prison, and specifically the scene with Paulie, played by Paul Sorvino. The first thing Henry does, basically, is to go to Paulie's house, where he's warned to stay away from drug dealing. This foreshadows what's going to cause Henry's downfall, and he's also warned about Jimmy and Tommy, saying they're cowboys that can cause him problems. More foreshadowing. But Henry doesn't listen. He immediately doubles up on his efforts to moving cocaine, and who does he call? Jimmy and Tommy. The stage has now been set for Henry's downfall, but at least he's got a really sweet TV. Another part of this nightmare stage is the Lufthansa heist and all of the aftermath of that. They plan the deal, we meet all the characters involved, and it's intercut with Henry's growing drug business, the rising paranoia, and the increasing risks. You got Jimmy whacking everybody in sight, and Henry getting more and more cornered. Things are getting really dark, and the pacing is really picking up. And then this section ends with Tommy getting whacked, and the stage is set for the destruction stage. In the destruction stage, everything begins to completely unravel. Fate's closing in, and Henry's paranoia grows. There's conflict in every sequence, in every scene, in every shot. There's a violence in every scene, whether it's bloody or the violence of words or the restless camera movements. It drives the entire story. And it's been the case for a lot of the movie, but in the destruction phase, it's gotten even more intense. Where the movie used to have these really long, elegant Steadicam shots, we now see short, staccato shots that absolutely crank up the intensity. The camera's constantly on the move. They show the character's point of view subjectively, and any sort of writing can benefit from that type of control over pacing. A lot of critics argue that Goodfellas doesn't really have a climax, and it doesn't if you look at it in a traditional 3-act structure sort of way. But even another tragedy like Brian De Palma's 1983 movie Scarface had a massive hail of bullets in the final deadly shootout, or the whirlwind of murders at the end of The Godfather. There's no gunfight like that in Goodfellas, but there doesn't really need to be. What there is a real feeling of panic in all these scenes. The scenes reflect the character's state of mind perfectly. And there is a death, but it's metaphorical. Henry Hill becomes a nobody. He turns state's evidence, and he rats on all his old friends. It's the ultimate character arc. The dream of a gangster's life, punctuated by about a dozen murders and a slow petering out into a normal existence. I think the whole movie works. The whole story works. And I don't see how you could give it a bad review, but to each their own. And while Henry doesn't die, literally, he joins the witness protection program where they give him a new identity. So in a way, Henry Hill, the gangster, dies and he's reborn as this nobody. And that's it. That's my take on the storytelling of Goodfellas. So what do you think? Agree, disagree? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And thanks for watching.
I'm an average nobody. Get to live the rest of my life like a schnook.